So, good morning, everyone. My name is Matthew Shears. I'm with the Center for Democracy and Technology. You're here for the business panel, Role of Business in Advancing an Open and Free Internet. And we have a wonderful panel here with us today. We have Ms. Amy Adams, Minister of Communication and Information Technology of New Zealand. We have Richard Allen, Vice President Policy, Europe, Middle East, and Africa for Facebook. We have Patrick Hesselius, Senior Advisor on Digital Rights for Telia Sonera. Matthew Johnston, CTO Guard Time, Ebele Okobi, Global Head for Human Rights with Yahoo, and Cynthia Wong for Human Rights Watch. And what we'd like to do today is actually make this as interactive a panel as possible. So we're going to go through a discussion. We'll have the panelists speak on a number of issues. We'll hopefully generate some discussion between the panelists. And then we'll come back and we'll open it up to the audience. And we'll do this a couple of times during the hour and a half that we have. So let me just pull up my notes. So I just wanted to take the moderator's prerogative and just make a couple of comments. The last time we met was in Tunis. A lot has happened this past year. Internet governance and internet rights have been challenged. The world has changed significantly. And there was, I think, a whiff of hypocrisy in the air at the Freedom Online Coalition in Tunis. And we've since heard this morning from Foreign Minister Frans Timmermans that, indeed, the credibility of the Freedom Online Coalition is something that continues to need to be addressed. In a way, the language of the freedom of the internet had suddenly become tainted, and the internet was being used for things that perhaps we hadn't really thought were possible, or to the scale possible at that time. I think that probably Brazilian President Rousseff put it most capably back in September 2013 when she said that in the absence of the right to privacy, there can be no true freedom of expression and opinion, and therefore no effective democracy. So that was then. So how far have we come since then? How have things changed in the landscape, and what do we need to do to move forward? So we now have a United Nations General Assembly resolution on the right to privacy in the digital age. We have surveillance reform being considered in to a limited degree in some countries. We have new sets of principles to address some of the challenges we're facing, such as the necessary and proportionate principles. And just last week, we had the Net Mundial meeting in Brazil. But we also have reticence among governments to address the practice of surveillance. And we have other governments seeking to increase surveillance. There are new sets of principles to address some of these challenges, but we need to do more. And how much progress has been made, that's what we're going to talk about today. And where do we go from here? So what we want is a forward-looking discussion. We want to see and look at what can business do more, and what can all stakeholders do more to support business and to work together to forward human rights in the online environment. So with that, I'd like to go through ask the panelists to make a couple of comments. And if I may first, maybe I can turn to we're going to go on a first-name basis, by the way, even though we do have a minister in our midst. I'd like to turn to Amy, and if you could just give us a sense, perhaps, as to how the world has changed a little bit in terms of business and human rights and other stakeholders, and just a couple of brief comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matthew, and thank you for the welcome and the introduction. I'm conscious that I'm the only government representative on the panel, so I'll perhaps come at some of what we'll be discussing from a slightly different standpoint to some of the other panelists, but that's probably a healthy thing. Certainly for us in New Zealand, we have both a very strong focus on the challenges and the opportunities that the digital world brings us, because we are a very small country right at the bottom of the world, and connectivity really opens up possibilities for us that previously would have been completely unheard of. But with that, we're very cognizant, of course, of the other side of the new digital world, which is that whole digital challenges piece, and certainly looking at some of the traditional issues like privacy and how it's replicated in the digital world, the updating of law enforcement and surveillance techniques and replicating that in a digital world and how that works. Just dealing with some of the jurisdictional issues that the whole internet world really challenges the basis of statehood in some ways, because as sovereign states, we're very used to being the sole rule makers within our dominion and our domains. And of course, with the internet, it doesn't work that way. And so it's a really quite a different way of thinking how we work as governments, how we ensure our citizens' rights, and how we balance not just, as we heard this morning, not just the freedoms of individuals, but the freedoms and rights of companies, of states, of groups of individuals, and how those rights intersect. And for me, I think it's before we can have a meaningful discussion about how we protect freedoms online, we have to really test our understanding of what those freedoms mean and where those intersections are, because it's not a simple, single concept. It's a very, very complicated and it's a very difficult line-drawing exercise to establish exactly what all of those freedoms are, how they intersect, and how freedoms in one space will impinge on rights somewhere else. So these are all issues that we're certainly working through, and it'll be very interesting to hear some of the panelists' views on how that, particularly for me, that government-business intersection can address some of those challenges.
Thank you. We'll just keep going round, I think. So, Richard, if you can.
I think what we've seen, particularly in the last year, is a continuation of a trend that's been going on for some time, which is that politicians naturally, in the exercise of their functions, and we heard Frans Timmermans this morning talking about politicians and governments having as their primary concern, for example, the security of their citizens. In the exercise of those functions, they will focus their attention on whatever is most important and relevant at the time. And I think historically, governments focused in particular on traditional mainstream media and telecommunications companies within their own countries as objects of attention when seeking to exercise their responsibilities around security, around speech online, or around speech more generally, around that range of government responsibilities. And what's happened is, just quite simply, as the internet has become more important and as online platforms have become more important channels, that attention is shifting. And so what we're seeing as online service providers is far more engagement from government around difficult issues, and issues typically related to security, access to data, and issues related to speech in various forms. If you like your government, that attention is benign. The government is exercising its responsibilities in order to keep you safe. If you don't like your government, that attention is malign. It's trying to suppress things or interfere with your freedoms in a way that's unwelcome. And we get both kinds. And that judgment as to whether or not it's benign or malign is a tough one that I'm sure we're going to explore through this panel. But what's certainly true is that we're seeing more laws or more attempts to legislate and more direct contact from governments who are concerned about activities that take place on online platforms, and we can only expect that to grow.
Patrick, from a telecoms operator perspective, tell us how it's changed.
Thank you. TeliaSonera is a telco in the Nordic and Baltics and Spain, and we have operations also here in Estonia, EMT and Elion, and we have operations in Eurasia. And when I look back on the last year's developments, not only in the US, but worldwide, one can either look at it in a pessimistic way, saying that, backward leaning, saying that everyone is doing overbroad surveillance and nothing to do about it, and let's continue. Or one can engage, like these days we gather 400 people here to see in an optimistic way to put these issues on the agenda and to find ways to make security and freedoms go hand in hand and support each other. And the optimistic way of looking upon it is that these issues are now really on the agenda, not only in this room, but in boardrooms of companies, on the political agenda in nations around the world, and also in lawmaking and in courts. A good example is the ruling the other week from the European Court of Justice, which looked on the European Data Retention Directive, which forces operators within the European Union to store data. The European Court of Justice ruled the directive to be, quote, invalid because it is not proportionate, taking the two needs into account, security and freedoms. So I have this optimistic view. The issues are on the agenda, and we can move forward to better protection of human rights.
Thank you, Patrick. Matt, why don't you say?
Yeah, I would have to echo Patrick's remarks. Just in the last year alone, so Guardtime at its foundation is an information assurance and cybersecurity company that focuses on data integrity and attribution, right? And so in the last year, we've received just a great amount of feedback, given that most of our customers are governments and then the telecommunications community. And so there's this perspective that regardless of legislative activities that are being considered to ensure citizen privacy or transparency into operations, is that the community needs to get ahead of this corporately and then from a government perspective. And so there's a real focus on integrity and then transparency and attribution into government interaction with citizen data, corporate interaction with citizen data, and then the transparency of that evidence back to the user so that they know that those rights have been preserved. Yeah.
Thank you. Ebele?
So the question of what's happened in a year, I think, so about a year ago, I was at the Stockholm Internet Forum, and I remember speaking on a panel and having a conversation about, it was before the Snowden revelations, and having a conversation about internet freedom and privacy and security, and there is a remark, something about there are good countries and there are bad countries. And I remember specifically saying that those were not useful distinctions. And I think, and what's interesting is like a month later, the Snowden revelations came out. I think it's been very useful to help ground the debate, because I've been at Yahoo for since 2008, and I've always talked about the fact that these are issues, the hard questions companies face are questions that we face around the world, and being able to ground the debate in the conversation that this is an issue, a rule of law issue around the world, has been very helpful. Having said that, I do think that some of the conversation that focuses a lot on surveillance has shifted focus from some of the hard questions, which are, when I think about what I want in the future, I would hope that we, as the conversation would focus back on those hard questions, which are taking as fact that where companies operate, there are laws. Taking as fact that there is a very real responsibility of countries to figure out legislation that respects human rights, and that the role of a company, I think the guiding principles set it out, I think, very well. It talks about the role of governments vis-a-vis the role of companies. My hope is that in the future, the debate focuses very much on what specifically companies can and should do within the guiding principles. So yes, there's a responsibility, the duty to respect, but what exactly does that mean? So if you're a company and you're operating in an environment where there's a democratically elected government, and that democratically elected government has created laws, and I think Turkey's an excellent example, that impinge on freedom of expression, what exactly does a company that's trying to do the right thing do? And so that's my hope for where this will lead us. That yes, I think surveillance, the conversation about surveillance is important because it speaks very much to the ecosystem and whether or not citizens can trust that their governments are doing the right thing. But let's move beyond that and talk about the hard questions.
Cynthia.
Sure. I just wanted to pick up on what you said about trust. I think when this community gathers in places like this, it's really easy to forget just how much we take for granted the expertise that we all have around internet issues, right? And it's easy to forget just how little the average internet user out there understands about what information is being collected about them and how it's really being used, at least up until last year. And I think that's one of the major shifts that's occurred in the last year, which is that a much broader set of internet users, of citizens, fully understand just how invasive surveillance has become and just how many resources and just how much governments are using this in ways that restrict their rights. And so I think when you realize that a government can paint a fairly detailed portrait of your life with one single request to your mobile phone carrier or to your social network of choice, then we need to really rethink how do we protect privacy in that sense. When it comes to trusting companies, I think the loss of trust has really stemmed from the idea that the companies, especially in response to Snowden, have said, look, we're not willingly collaborating in this surveillance. And in surveillance around the world, many companies are saying, we're not willingly doing this, we're being compelled to, and we're trying to fight for our users' rights. But as an average internet user, it's really hard to verify whether that's the case, right? I think the adage is trust but verify. How do we really know that the companies are doing what they can in order to respect rights, recognizing that there needs to be more guidance developed, and how can we verify that? Just to make clear, just picking up on Richard and Abele's point, while the revelations of this past year have really focused on a handful of governments, I think this is a much broader issue. And while we haven't done a full comparative study of all governments around the world, I would venture to guess that in most states around the world, the rate of technological change has far outpaced the ability of legal protections for privacy to really keep up. And I think we need to be examining surveillance and privacy issues and freedom of expression issues in all countries around the world. And the other thing is, as Abele mentioned, companies, again, are being enlisted by many governments around the world, not just the ones that have been at issue in the past year, to facilitate censorship and to facilitate surveillance as well. And so these are all trends that we collectively need to grapple with and really restore trust, because it's really vital to a bunch of different interests. And out of self-interest, I will say that as a human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, and someone who works with human rights defenders and journalists, we really need to fix this and get this right and restore that trust, because otherwise the internet, which is otherwise a boon to our work and a real amplifying force for human rights defenders, is just going to completely undermine our ability to do that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Cynthia. So I'd like to come back on the issue of trust. A lot of people have said over the past year that they've lost trust in the internet. Personally, I believe that we've lost trust in those entities that use the internet to undermine our rights. But I'd be interested in knowing from you to what measures have been taken, or to what degree have we tried to reassert or reclaim that trust over the past year, and how have you seen that manifested in different ways? Or indeed, do you believe that we're losing trust in the internet? Maybe, Amy, if you could start.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, just picking up on Cynthia's point at the end, it always strikes me as interesting that their focus is very much on business as the defender of these, governments looking out to conduct surveillance on their citizens, and the poor old businesses are being forced to comply with these nasty governments. It was interesting, President Ilve's comments this morning when he made the comment that big data will know much more about you than Big Brother ever will. And I think one of the interesting things of the last little while is that there's been this very strong focus, probably due to Snowden and a number of other revelations, on what governments are doing in that space. But certainly in my experience, and I can only speak for my country, governments' use of, or collection of data and use of data is incredibly tightly controlled under a very, very transparent, judicially overseen system with a statutory basis and many layers of accountability back for that. And I think in some ways the unknown part of that trust puzzle is the use of that data in an extra government sense, so that the extent to which businesses themselves are collating and using users' information. And I think part of getting that trust piece back is doing exactly what we're doing, which is having the discussions about, well, what can you expect as your private information in a digital age? What rights should companies have to collect and use your data? Can you expect that, of course, Visa are going to know everything I've spent, and Google are going to know everything I've clicked, and they're going to use that information for their own corporate gains. And I think part of the trust issue has come from the fact that, as was said down the panel, that the speed of technology and the speed of adoption of this new world has completely outstripped our sort of discussions and frameworks about understanding what it means. What does intellectual property mean in a digital world? It's quite different to when the copyright and the trademark laws were written. What does privacy mean? What can we expect? What should be freely available? What is protected? And I think the fact that we haven't really had those discussions in a very public way has undermined the trust. And I don't think the answers are simple. But I think the only way to get that trust back is to put some of the issues on the table and get those discussions out there, both from government's use and collection of data, but equally from the private sector's own use and collection of data, which to my mind is probably far less transparent and overseen than certainly what most governments and free democracies are faced with at the moment. But perhaps that's just my bias.
I see some shaking heads down the end there. I'm very happy for us to have a discussion among the panelists, of course, but Richard.
I will respectfully disagree. I mean, if you looked, for Facebook outside of the United States and Canada, our data usage is regulated under European Union data protection law because we operate out of Facebook Ireland, an Irish entity. And it's really interesting what we have to go through. So all of our use of data is governed by regulation. We have to have valid reasons to collect data. We have to demonstrate why we have those valid reasons. We can only retain data as long as we have a reasonable business purpose. We have auditors come in and check everything we do, including looking at our databases. We have a data use policy, a privacy policy that is our contract with our users that they agree to for the use of their data when they sign up to their service. I would love to see governments doing the same thing. Frankly, I actually think what the challenge now is to extend that kind of protection to our relationship to government. President Ilves was talking about that earlier, the contract with government. I am happy as a British citizen to sign up to a contract with the British government about when they can carry out surveillance of my activity online. I understand and recognize that the British government has a legitimate interest in keeping me safe. But what I want is the same kind of thing I get with a commercial online service. I want that to be spelled out in general terms. I don't expect to know all the detail. I understand why for security reasons I can't do that. But tell me in general terms what will happen with my data and how government uses my data and why they're doing that. And I can agree to that as a contract between me and them. I think the problem at the moment is if you look at data protection law, which does exist in many countries around the world, it has this great big carve-out, typically at Clause 1, that says, Clause 1.1, this does not apply to the security services or law enforcement agencies, and they get this massive carve-out from the whole thing. And then we get surprises. And I think if, what damages trust, it's surprise. It's I signed up for one thing and something else happened. And so we as commercial companies, we really are incentivized to avoid those surprises, and regulation requires us to take steps to avoid those surprises. In the surveillance and the law enforcement space, we have seen surprises over the last year because we didn't know what was happening. I actually think most people will accept things happening as long as they're told, and it's the lack of transparency that I think undermines trust.
So I have a slightly similar but a little bit different take, and I think and I'm speaking for Yahoo, I do think that there are things that companies can do to be a little bit more transparent about consumer privacy. I mean, I think mostly because if you think about how do you communicate to users about consumer privacy? I mean, you do it in a privacy policy, right? And how many of you understand all the privacy policies for all of the products you use? I mean, if someone could raise their hand, I mean, that would be a shocker. Having said that, I do think that it is very important to make a distinction between consumer privacy, not because I don't think it's important, I do think it's important, and the privacy vis-a-vis government requests for data, or privacy vis-a-vis government requests for content moderation. Even the term, I think, is a little bit misleading. It's not a request, it's companies and individuals being compelled. And I think to the extent there is a power that government has that companies do not have. And again, and I preface this by saying I do think that companies have a particular responsibility, but the power of a state is vastly different from the power of a company. If you decide that you don't want to use Facebook, you don't have to use Facebook. If you decide you don't want to use Flickr, you don't have to use Flickr. If you are a citizen of a country, unless you leave that country, you are compelled by the laws of that country. And because of that, that is why issues related to governments are much more important, and we should not conflate the two. I think conflating the two lulls people into a sense of complacency around A, their responsibility and duties as citizens, and B, their vulnerability as citizens.
Patrick.
Yes, thank you, Bella. I agree very much with that distinction, also from another point of view, and that is that consumer data protection, single company can work with on its own to apply national legislation, to purge data, and to follow data protection authorities' decisions, etc. However, when it comes to Big Brother privacy, it's very difficult for a company to work by its own. That's why we see companies join forces. Like the internet companies have joined in the GNI, the telcos have joined in the telecom industry dialogue. We are 9 companies that work together and have defined a platform and defined how we want to protect privacy in the Big Brother context. And based on that joint industry platform, we can have a better point of challenge when when there is overbroad requests and demands for user data.
In just a quick response. I mean, I completely agree that there is a very clear distinction in terms of the potential impact and harm to rights between what governments do in their surveillance practices and companies' own data protection, or sorry, data collection and privacy practices, right? I mean, after all, governments can throw people in jail, companies not so much, at least right now, they can't. But I think if we're going to restore trust, I think part of the element of the loss of trust on the industry side is that users do recognize that companies have a commercial interest in collecting as much data about them as possible, right? And companies have an interest in collecting more data than they really need to provide certain kinds of services. And so I do think there is a nexus there, which is that if companies were limited in their data collection, then there would be less available for the government to collect in the first place. And so I do think in terms of moving towards building trust, transparency is a really good first step on both sides. So both the governments need to be more transparent about how they're using their surveillance powers so that we can have a rational debate as to whether that's justified, and companies need to as well so that users have a better sense of their own risk.
Just to backstop what Cynthia was saying, so about a year ago I had an opportunity to sit on a congressional panel basically on emerging threat, and trust was a large issue both on the commercial side and then on the government side. And the overriding issue was that the front lines for cyber warfare, network exploitation, corporate espionage, and state-sponsored espionage. Literally, the front lines are the telecommunications community. They're the companies. They're the repositories that hold the data that those nation states or those companies are trying to get at. And so, what came up, in the panel is that, trust on the side of a government is that government generally develops policies and activities, in conjunction with trying to actually protect its citizenry or its national sovereignty, right? And so they develop, authorities and activities basically focused on that, whereas, companies and corporations are in fact, interested in, offering services, a rich set of services to the user base, but in the end, they're interested in monetizing those services. And so there has to be some level of auditability and transparency into the frameworks and the governance models that govern how government is interacting with that information to prevent those activities in the context of preserving their sovereignty, and then for corporations as well to ensure that the monetization strategies, the services strategies that they in fact offer to their user base, don't become out of control. And so I think there's a balance there.
I'd just like to come back to something you said, Richard, which was the issue of surprises, and that this past year has been full of surprises. Government has a responsibility to provide a predictable and workable and understandable and transparent regime, regulatory regime, policy processes, etc. Do you think that part of the surprise element of the past year is specifically due to this lack of real or perceived of transparency in terms of surveillance practices? I mean, is that something that we can attribute directly to this, or how important is this issue of surprise and predictability?
So I think surprise is really important from the point of view of the trust debate we're having now. But I'd just qualify it. So it was surprising, I think, to people generally to understand what was going on. It was not surprising to the expert community. And so I remember sitting in debates on the UK regulation years ago with people from Privacy International, some of whom I think are here, where all of these questions were brought out. We sat there and said, but this regulation will allow the British government to tap into fiber optic cables and read all the email going to US-based webmail providers, and the government kind of went, yeah, but we want the power. So what was interesting for me, what's interesting now, if we are thinking about how do we take steps forward, I think having models for surveillance legislation that are broadly adopted internationally, that are human rights respectful, will reduce surprise in future. But in order to develop those models, we need to listen to the expertise, to that sort of narrow expert audience who are telling us what are going to be the challenges 5 and 10 years hence. Had we listened 5 or 10 years ago when we were crafting FISA legislation in the United States, or the equivalent legislation in the United Kingdom and other countries, we might have come up with a much better framework and a less surprising one. So that's, I think, the most important thing now is to say that you're right, we look at the most forward-looking end of the debate in order to decide what those legislative models should now look like for the next 10 years.
Anybody else on the panel want to comment at this point in time? Otherwise, I'd like to open it to the audience.
Can I just say one thing, which is
Yep.
that we've sort of been conflating a whole lot of issues in the discussion so far, which is interesting. But you really do, I think, have to be quite careful to draw a distinction between mass surveillance techniques, which is sort of the dragnet of information, very targeted law enforcement interception operations under warrant. Then there's the issue of content moderation, which is another whole issue and debate again. And I think it's quite difficult when you sort of conflate them all together and try and talk about them as a single mass, because there are very different drivers, risks and appropriate responses depending on which of them you are looking at. And equally, of course, every country, as every company does, works under a slightly different regime. So I don't want to get thrown in with some of what other countries do that I know we don't do in New Zealand. But I do think that you need to carefully delineate between some of those issues, particularly with data collection, data use, and then content moderation. And content moderation is one we perhaps haven't talked about as much, but in the debate that we have seen this morning around the way some authoritarian states are using control of the internet to try and shut down and control the information going through to their citizens. It is much more actually in that space of content control, site blocking, and that is a very different set of challenges, I think, to debate than the sort of the more generic surveillance interactions that we've perhaps been talking about this morning. So that would be the only comment I would make, is that we do have to be a little bit careful as to what we're talking about.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that a little later on. Patrick, did you want to comment?
Yeah, to follow up on that, as I told you, TeliaSonera is part of the industry dialogue, and actually I'm representing during these 2 days also the 9 companies industry dialogue. And we have learned a lot as TeliaSonera from the discussions within the industry dialogue. And one conclusion is the one that you are outlining here, that there are day-to-day lawful intercept, which are understandable. In a democratic society, you need to find the criminals and fight terrorism, etc. But then there are what I call major events. So blocking, shutdown, and the most far-reaching one is what is called unrestricted real-time access. So in many countries, you have both of these systems in place. You have lawful intercept, where police and other authorities go to the operators and ask for an extract from data, traffic data or something, to be able to go to court for drug dealings or something. But in parallel, in many countries, there is this unrestricted real-time access, where the government has access to everything what's happening in the networks and the systems. And the operator has no control on what the government gets and how much and how often, etc. And we have, as TeliaSonera, elaborated a policy on these major events, which was published in December last year, and which is available on our homepage in 7 languages, in 2 languages. And there we list what we mean by major events and what we do about them.
Matthew, I'd just add one more thing. It's interesting just on surprises. So I think surprises are going to continue to happen. So a lot of the feedback that we obtain both from governments and the telecommunications industry is that the internet is a complicated place, right? And we have public, private, and then we have hybrid environments. And there's, an insufficient level of instrumentation, for data to understand essentially where it goes, who's touched it, how it's transformed, right? And then ultimately what happens to it. And if you account that the majority of the traffic that's actually being generated on the internet is machine-to-machine, generated data, right? Those interactions become automated, they're abstracted, and those further abstractions are even harder to account for without some fundamental level of attribution as to where the data's gone, who's owned it, and then what's happened to it, right? And so this problem is only going to continue to increase without, some of the new technologies that actually exist to bring that attribution to the data level, so that the user, the government, and the corporation actually understands how it's being transformed, where it's gone, and whether or not they're liable, right, in between those interactions for who's actually abused the privilege. Right?
Okay, great. We want to open the floor now. We want to have a really good discussion. So I hope you've got some good questions for the panel. because then after that, we're going to turn slightly in another direction and really go back and look at some of the basics in terms of what are the roles and responsibilities of the various parties, for governments, for business, and others. So let me see. Do we have a mic in the back? Yes. Yes, gentleman in the back there, please. If you can just say who you are, and if you want to direct it to someone in particular, then please do so. Thanks.
I kind of want to direct it both to the companies and to the NGOs, but Lucas Silvas, European Commission. Haven't heard the word net neutrality, and maybe that's to be expected because this is sort of a foreign ministries event, not a telecoms ministries event, if you will. And so far the discussion, both in the US and Europe, on net neutrality has been one of consumer rights and not one of human rights. And hopefully that's not really a huge issue either in Europe or the US, because the type of, the space of the debate is really about profit and how you balance that with consumer rights. But do any of you see an issue, sort of a place where those could meet up with the discussion on human rights? Perhaps different forms of net neutrality legislation outside of the US and Europe, or perhaps scenarios where depending on the way you go on those telecoms regulations, either in the US or Europe, you could also have human rights issues. Thank you.
Let me just preface that before, if somebody wants to volunteer to take that, by saying that I was in Sao Paulo last week at the Net Mundial meeting. Network neutrality was debated extensively and various texts were put forward. At the end of the day, there was no agreement on any of the text. And so the issue has been punted to some other fora, probably the IGF or something like that, just because of that reason. So it's not as easy, even amongst similar environments, to have that kind of agreement on text. So I don't know if anybody wants to take the issue of network neutrality.
I can. Oh, well, look, I'll jump in. You can never shut a politician up. Look, I think it's a really valid point, actually, because the whole debate around net neutrality, taken to its logical conclusion, is that if not managed well, it becomes a de facto setting of how you access content, what content you can access, and the quality of access to it. And I think we do have to be very careful, and this is where, if we take the topic that we're discussing, the way businesses interact in the space has a huge effect on the consumer experience of the internet, how well they experience it, their levels of access, the speed, and we have great concerns around the ways that the business models of some ISPs are developing in such a way that could really seriously impinge on consumers' right to access content in a very neutral way. Now in New Zealand it's as much around metering or unmetering data towards data caps. I know in other countries it's around the throttling of the traffic and commercial deals that are done. But the net effect of all of it is that it comes to and I'm drawing a particularly probably outrageous parallel, but it's a sort of a similar effect in terms of state blocking of content, because it's not a complete prohibition on content. It actually has, from a user experience, a similar outcome. So, absolutely we're right to talk about states' control of content and state moderation and blocking of content, but I think at the business level, the discussion around how internet businesses set up those business models to maximize revenue and whether that has a corresponding impact on consumers' access to information has to be part of that debate. And I don't have the answers, and as you just mentioned, Matthew, the answers are not easy, but I think it would be misleading to have a debate around content regulation without equally looking at the business aspect of that, which is very much in terms of how that traffic is monitored and measured and throttled.
Thank you, Amy. Cynthia?
Sure. So as the human rights NGO, I will just say that we do view net neutrality as squarely a human rights issue. And I'm going to just quote a couple of recent UN reports and principles. The UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, Frank LaRue, in his pivotal report on the internet in 2011, he very clearly said that the internet is now increasingly essential to the exercise of many different human rights, beyond just access to information and freedom of expression, but also association, access to knowledge and culture, education, and the like. And it's only going to become more so, I would say. And the UN guiding principles also have something to say about this, which is that states do have an obligation to safeguard against infringement of rights by third parties, including the corporate sector. And so I think when it comes to net neutrality and what companies are thinking about in their business models, if it does have an effect on human rights, states have an obligation to really take a hard look at that and to make sure that rights are being protected in that context.
Okay, Bertrand, and then the lady in the back, I think.
Hi, good morning. My name is Bertrand Lachapelle. I'm the director of the Internet and Jurisdiction Project. Two quick comments. The first one is related to the amount of data that is collected by companies. In the past, there was a necessity, particularly versus telcos, to have data retention laws to force the company to keep the data for a certain period of time. In most of the social platforms today, we as users are putting a lot of data ourselves because we want to store it and share it, and we want it to be kept as long as possible. I mean, I'm using Gmail, and I'm very happy that I can still go back to mails that were there 10 years ago. So this is a different situation because the data is there, it doesn't have to be required, and the fact that it is potentially accessible makes it even more tempting. A second thing, this was more a comment, a second thing is related to what you mentioned regarding content. And as the title is, the role of business in advancing the open and free internet, it is true, and this is probably directed more to Richard and Ebele, it is true that the platforms have a huge responsibility today in having to respond to a lot of pressure or requests regarding content takedowns according to the respective national laws, and they are de facto in a position of having to strike the balance of preserving a certain number of rights and respecting national laws. Can you elaborate a little bit on that without preempting the follow-up discussion?
Are we preempting?
We're kind of preempting our discussion as we go forward. Can we, Bertrand, would you mind if we hold that? Is that all right? All right, there's a lady in the back, and then Niels, and then we've got the gentleman in the front here, and you, sir, and then we'll stop it for there, I think, because we need to move along. So, yes, please.
I'm Jane Lute. I'm the president of the Council on Cybersecurity. My question relates to what's the greatest threat at the moment to an open and free internet? And it seems to me that the greatest threat, quite frankly, is the lack of security and safety. 20 years after the web has been widely available, there's nothing we can do online safe and confident that our information or our identities won't be subject to compromise. Yet, neither the business community nor the advocacy community has come online in a strong way for basic hygiene that we know from technologists will prevent 80 to 90% of all known attacks. Why not? Why isn't the business community and why isn't the advocacy community associated deeply with good cyber hygiene? And how can we change that?
Great question. Who wants to take that?
I think we are.
Yeah.
So I actually, from within a company where I work, I think we do an extraordinary amount to try and help people keep secure. It's never enough, and there's always more that we can do. And I think, there has been given another impetus to that by events over the last year. But a lot of it, frankly, was already underway. So we've done things like where we can detect that a user who comes to our services has got a compromised machine, directing them towards installing appropriate software to deal with that compromise. We push out two-factor authentication as a great way of doing that. If you are a Facebook user and you don't normally log in from Estonia and you're logging in while you're here, you may well be confronted with extra security measures. Those are designed to keep our service safe and make sure that, because when an account is compromised, it doesn't just compromise that account, but it potentially compromises other accounts. So it's there to protect the community more generally. But I think through that, I certainly think services like ours, and I'm sure Yahoo have similar measures, and TeliaSonera I'm sure do for their users. I actually think that, if we look at the services today compared with 3-4 years ago, we are doing far more than we did before. The challenge is to do more, and I think we should absolutely continue to do that. But I think to say that we're not responding at all, I think, is underplaying the efforts that have been made by the security teams in the different businesses.
Yeah, I would just agree. I mean, I think that companies are all of the time trying to figure out ways to do better to protect our users, from encryption to the recent announcement around DMARC. And we actually get get criticized a fair amount because people say, oh, the security measures that you put into place impinge on other rights. So, for example, we've got a huge pushback around DMARC from certain people within the internet community who say that because they're unable to send out now letters from their mailing lists, or they have to use workarounds in order to do it because we use P equals reject. That has been mentioned as, oh, this is something that you have done too much. You have overcorrected. So actually, I don't agree that companies are not present, because this is something that it not only does it affect our users, it affects our ability to operate and our ability to do business. So I actually disagree with that point. I mean, I think to the extent that you're saying, to the extent that the question is whether or not cybersecurity is treated as a human right, I mean, that may be a different observation, but I don't agree that that's something that companies don't care about.
Okay, sorry, I got Cynthia first.
Sure. I mean, just quickly, just responding as a human rights organization, I mean, security is our utmost priority. We have people in the field, staff in the field in over 60 countries around the world, and some in places that are quite insecure on a number of different levels. And we also work with sources and victims, and if we can't assure their security and the privacy of their information, then we basically can't do our work, right? But there's a lot of challenges, especially for smaller NGOs that are not our size, which are lack of resources, lack of technical and human capacity. Sometimes people are living in places with very slow internet speeds, which limits some of their options in terms of security tools and that kind of thing. And so I do think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I think we need to build better bridges between especially the traditional human rights community and this community gathered here. And I think one of the good things that has come out of the last year is the companies are really beginning to take some serious steps to shore up some of the security, their security practices when it comes to their users.
Okay, Matt, quickly.
Yeah, one thing, just to kind of answer your point. So we've seen kind of a sea change between both governments and then commercial companies. So, in the past, for about the last 20 years, the security model has been basically a layered security defense. And with the volume and the velocity of applications and new software that's released, there's always implementation-specific vulnerabilities. There's always malware. There's always a code flaw. There's always something that nobody predicts, a zero-day exploit that basically exploits one of those layers in that layered security defense. And so the security industry spends billions of dollars a year basically trying to address those vulnerabilities. But there's no perfect human being, there's no perfect developer, and there's no perfect code, right? And so we see the sea change and the shift from focusing on multiple layers of security defense and confidentiality encryption to integrity monitoring, so that for the volume and the velocity of delivered software or delivered applications and so forth, monitoring that baseline software and then detecting changes is a new form of protection and detection in order to enhance security. And governments have shifted, in large part because of a lot of the innovations realized in Estonia, to focus from confidentiality and a layered defense model to integrity monitoring to account for an assumption of compromise. Right?
Thanks. I like the way you phrase that, basic hygiene, because when you think about basic hygiene, you're talking about parenting, you're talking about education, you're talking about community. So I think those that are involved in the responsibilities are of all stakeholders, but it goes even far beyond that. But thanks for the question. Niels.
Hello, Niels de Noever, Head of Digital at Article 19. I have a question for Facebook and a question for Yahoo. So Richard earlier said that they're doing a great job in abiding by local laws, like it's something to be commendable for. Well, I think we all have to abide by local laws, so that should go without saying, doesn't it? But please allow me to quote one from your transparency report on Pakistan, where you write, "We restricted access in Pakistan to a number of pieces of content primarily reported by the Pakistan Telecommunications Authority and the Ministry of Information Technology under local laws prohibiting blasphemy and criticism of the state." Well, we've been talking to quite a lot of lawyers in Pakistan, and they were never aware of any local law forbidding criticism of the state. So I'd like your comments on that. And from Yahoo, I think that a lot of Yahoo users cannot use mailing lists right now because of wrong implementation of encryption standards, and not, as you said, that you did it too well. But what I'd really like your comment on is that if you're going to really care as much about your users, Why was Yahoo so slow in adopting SSL as a standard login? But even worse, when on January 5 this year, Fox IT reported that an estimated number of 5 million computers got affected. Why did the users not get informed about that?
Richard.
So on the Pakistan question, I think we may be speaking to the same lawyers as well about this. It may help people to get an insight into how those decisions are made. We've tried to be as transparent as we can in our transparency report, and I'm sure more information will come out about specific cases. So we get the Pakistan Telecommunications Authority sending us a notice saying you are legally required to block access to a particular page on Facebook. And that comes through. And with it comes an authorization that says the reason we are requiring you to do this in the case of those pages is because a committee of the Ministry of Telecommunications in Pakistan, and you forgive me, the name is something like the Committee for the Banning of Websites. It has some fancy name. That committee has determined that this content is illegal in Pakistan, and it'll give a reason, blasphemy or anti-state. So those are two reasons they gave us, and that's why we put them in the transparency report. When we receive this request, and we'll do this for any country, we go to our outside counsel, experts in local law, and we say to them, is this request enforceable? Does it appear to be valid under Pakistani law? Are we required to comply with it? And if our outside counsel says to us, yes, it's a valid enforceable law under Pakistani law, there is a committee of the Ministry of Telecommunications that is empowered to ban websites in Pakistan, citing various grounds, and they do pass those to the Pakistani Telecommunications Authority, and the PTA is required to block access to that site, either by passing the notice to the service provider or by turning off the entire website at the network level in Pakistan. Then we will respond by restricting access to that content. It's not an easy decision, but the alternative is you restrict access to the site as a whole. So our test is, was there a lawful authority that on the face of it appears valid to us? Have we validated that that lawful authority appears to be correct? And therefore, are we required to block access to that particular piece of content in order to maintain access to the whole of the service? Where people raise with us and say to us, actually, we don't think that that law is correct or it's not being interpreted correctly, then we will engage with them, and I think we are engaged in a dialogue right now. I mean, that was why we published the transparency report, precisely so that other third parties could engage with us around the orders we're receiving. One of the positive spin-offs is we're now speaking to lawyers in Pakistan who are saying to us, well, we take a different view. And if it turns out that those requests are invalid under Pakistani law, then we would be delighted to restore access to that content. So it's not that we want to block it, it's just that our legal advisors tell us we're required to do so. And I'd be happy at lunch break to carry on the conversation if you have more information around the invalidity of those orders. If that's true, then as I say, we'd be delighted to lift the blocks.
Okay.
So the first question was about why it took Yahoo so long to employ encryption. And I think one of the things that I think is important to remember is Yahoo is the oldest, so of the companies here, for internet companies, we're the oldest company. Our platforms are quite old, and particularly internationally, there's a way that the code was written and the way that the code was added onto other code that made encryption technically very difficult. And not only was it technically fairly difficult, it was something that could break the front end in a lot of different ways. And so within Yahoo, the conversation about how to do this in a way that wouldn't put our users at risk and how to do this in a way that wouldn't break our systems has been going on for years. And so it took as long as it took because technically it was something that was quite difficult. I say that not as an excuse, but as a reason. So that's why it took as long as it did. We're pleased to say that we are where we are now. We recognize that we were late. But the fact that we were late is not due to the fact that people internally weren't pushing for it. I was a huge advocate for it, as were many of our colleagues, particularly our securities team, or the team that we call the Paranoids. It's something that they have been advocating internally since I got there, which is in 2008. And I think the second question was around mailing lists, so whether or not people are able to send. I'm sorry? And so you're saying we didn't react to it?
You didn't inform any user about this attack and vulnerability that have been reported by Fox IT and others, and no users have been informed.
I actually don't know. I actually don't know about that, but I'm happy to look into that and give you information about it. I don't know. That's not within my purview, but I'm happy to find out about it and let you know.
Okay, thank you. We have two more. This gentleman right here.
So my name is Hauke and I do work for Reporters Without Borders in Germany, and I have a question for Richard. So we see all the time, we see reports about Facebook blocking access to some sites. The most recent case in Germany was a German magazine called Cicero, and there was an article published that took a stance on abortion. And after this article was published, the whole Facebook page of Cicero has been disabled. And so my question is there any limit to what journalists can write on Facebook other than local law? Because I do feel that we see American values, especially on abortion, on breastfeeding, on nudity, guiding a lot of blocking policies. And so I would like your comment on that.
Yeah. I mean, we host the content that people post onto Facebook. We have a set of rules for that. The rules are there on the site, again, very transparent. There are community standards. And they do say clearly, for example, that nudity is not permitted on the site. You know, you can disagree with the rules, but those are the rules we've established which we think are appropriate for the community of people that are using the service in general. We refine the rules from time to time as we get feedback from the people who use the service. Breastfeeding, I'm pleased to say, is not actually forbidden on Facebook. That's, again, something, the rule was applied incorrectly, and let's just be clear as well, we make mistakes in the way in which we enforce the rule. And if you operate at the scale we do and you make a mistake even 0.01% of the time, that's quite a lot of mistakes. And so, yes, we make mistakes. Sometimes we take content down inappropriately, and that happened with some breastfeeding content, and therefore the whole thing has continued to be something where, as a platform, people believe something about our policies that's incorrect. If you go onto Facebook, type breastfeeding, you'll see lots of breastfeeding photos, but you won't see, for example, full nudity photos. Full nudity photos are prohibited on the service. So there are limits. Some people will create a Facebook page, and they will repeatedly post nude photos, and they may believe that they're perfectly artistic and reasonable or journalistic in their own context, but we will shut down the page for repeated violations. It's not a great place to be. We would much rather the people who have the page on our service respected the rules and followed the rules and blurred things out appropriately and so on, but it does happen. And it's a source of great regret. We don't want to shut down pages on Facebook. We really don't. But at the same time, the rules apply to everyone on the service, and we do enforce them. Yeah. So the question is, do we have special sensitivity of journalist content? This has been raised with us, and again I will use an analogy which I've used repeatedly, that when you talk to big internet service, we are like ducks on the water, so we are sailing serenely along in a particular direction, and you just see the duck on the water, but you don't see the feet underneath paddling furiously, which is us having huge internal debates about our policies and whether they're correct or not correct, but occasionally the duck will change direction because of the paddling that's going on. One of the areas that we're paddling around, frankly, at the moment is how do we deal with journalistic content? Because we have been dealing with a number of major publications where we've taken down their pages. They come to us and they say, you know, this is editorialized, it's good journalistic content, why are you doing that? And we don't want to be in a position of removing that content. And so we are, you know, we have a lot of intense internal debate about can we adjust our rules to stop that happening. But again, every time you have one of those debates, you'll hit the challenge of saying, well, how do we define a journalist? How do we define good editorialized content versus not editorialized content? Should we be in the position of saying this publication can break the rules, but that one can't? And so we go around those debates, feet paddling a lot. I hope that we improve over time, both in terms of the quality of enforcement and the rules themselves. But I would be lying to you if I said it was a sort of fixed, static position. We're constantly thinking about these issues.
Okay, last one from the gentleman who's there, and then we do need to move on because we're running out of time.
Hello, my name is Jargal. I'm from Mongolia, a blogger. Two-level questions. First, at the national level, if there is any government or country which reports how many times the state used private information from the phone operators, if there is such a report, and why it was used, somehow general explanation, maybe preventing certain crimes, etc. This sort of level. Second, from such a global company like yours, if you can report every year individual government requests approaching you to disclose particular materials. We don't require you to a particular case to be reported, but in general, say that country requests that many times, this. In that way, we can compare certain countries, governments, how they allow free internet.
So the last part of your question, that already happened. So the transparency, and not for every single company, but certainly a number of companies do transparency reporting. I think your question about government transparency reporting is an ongoing question, and is something that the companies have called for, NGOs have called for as well, for governments to report on content moderation requests and for requests for user information. So that doesn't happen, and that's certainly something I think citizens within countries should advocate for, because we, as companies, we have advocated for that.
Okay, actually, because we're kind of tight on time, we're going to use your question to segue right into the issue on transparency, if that's okay. We're jumping ahead a bit, but I think it's a good time to talk about transparency best practices, what we can expect in terms of transparency going forward. So let's start to move this discussion in a little bit in the forward-looking direction. So who would like to take that on? Patrick, yeah.
I can start answering the direct question. If there are states submitting such reports, my home country, the government of Sweden, yearly reports to Parliament the amount of government requests. That report does not yet include requests from secret police, but other than that, it's quite substantive and contains all the numbers. The same is being done in Finland, and we think that is a very good practice. Of course, these reports can be made even better, and it is the view of my company and of my industry through the GSMA and through the industry dialogue, that it should be a priori the governments submitting these reports. However, companies, as far as possible, should aim for transparency reporting as well. Most importantly so as to the major events that we've been talking about. A huge problem there as to major events when it comes to blocking or shutdown of networks, etc., is that there are provisions of confidentiality. But as companies, we should aim to be transparent when there are major events. Lastly, just let me point to good work that is being done by CDT, the Center for Democracy and Technology, with a statement on transparency, which I hope will come out soon.
I think, just quickly on transparency, I think one of the things that would be interesting going forward is transparency about laws that mandate requests.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think companies can put out reports and say, you know, we got 1,000 requests from whichever country. In terms of really of that being something that users can understand, I think the other piece of information is really understanding what are the laws that relate to this. So what are the authorities that have what are the authorities within countries that have the authority to make these requests? On what topics can they make these requests? What types of information is forbidden to be online? I think transparency related to that, country by country, would be incredibly useful for people who are using it who are using the internet.
Amy, maybe I could just ask you if you could address the transparency issue.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to pick up on what Abele just said, because I think that's exactly right. In New Zealand, there are only a very small number of instances where the state can seek either personal information or have some say over content. Each of them are under specific legislative authority, and in each case there are reporting requirements, and obviously the detail of those reporting requirements is specific to the regime and appropriate to the regime. So, for example, our security services now do have to report annually to Parliament on the number of requests and the number of warrants sought and which type of warrants they were, without going into the case specifics. We are just working through a piece of legislation in New Zealand called the Harmful Digital Communications Bill, which is looking at the very difficult issue of cyberbullying. We've had a sort of a spate of young people driven to suicide and the like through very nasty online attacks, and trying to work out how you respond to that in this sort of more instant and viral environment. That regime has some enforcement aspects to it that can be worked through in terms of the content online, all of which has to be transparent and reported, and so there is the regime at the back of it. That is quite different to the protection of intellectual property violations online and the follow-up enforcement regime for that, which is equally reported under that framework. So to your point, I think that's exactly right. There are very specific, limited jurisdictional abilities to intervene, each of which has its own reporting requirements that go with it, with the appropriate level of disclosure.
Yes, Smith.
And Matt, just one of the things that I'd like to bring up in terms of a case study kind of example that I'm particularly excited about is so with the advent and the deployment of more identity management solutions driven to citizens within nation states that are offering kind of a rich set of services that the governments are offering, between finance, health, justice, everything from, taxation and accountability, is that underpinning a lot of those identity management solutions, we received a visit to our company by President Ilves a little over a week ago, and he made an interesting comment. He said basically that, privacy, accountability, and then transparency are not mutually exclusive. And so in Estonia, as it is with a number of nation states, every citizen is afforded, a credential, an identity card. That identity card allows them to on-ramp and authenticate, to a wide set of services that the government offers, but underpinning all of those services is basically the integrity, component that backstops that identity credential to ensure that there's complete transparency and accountability driven down to the citizen who can inspect, audit, and then interact with how the government and how companies are actually viewing their data. And so the government, companies, and then citizens can mutually audit each other's activities through that Crossroads platform, which Estonia has implemented. And that mutual auditability ensures that there's widely witnessed evidence among those three parties, ensuring that the right interactions are taking place within the right governance framework.
Sure. Since we're talking about, I think, the role of states here, and hopefully we'll move to the role of companies as well. I think in addition to transparency, which I think is a first step, and we have to remember that transparency is really a proxy, right? It's a proxy for understanding what are states actually doing and how are they actually using their powers. It's always going to be an imperfect proxy, but it's a good first step. There was a lot of talk about the credibility of the Freedom Online Coalition this morning among some of the speakers. And I think one of the best ways for the coalition to really start shoring that back up is to really lead by example here. And I think what we would like to see the countries do is make a firm commitment to do a systematic review of all their surveillance programs, both on the law enforcement side and the intelligence gathering side, and with other stakeholders, including those in this room, really develop concrete steps on what states need to do to reform to make sure that they are in line with their human rights obligations on the right to privacy, including making sure that their surveillance is both necessary and proportionate, as recommended by Frank LaRue in his report this year. So I think that's a really key thing. I know some of the governments are already doing that, but we would like to see all of the governments do that and lead by example. And the second thing is really the role of the home government, right? So governments where major global companies are based, I think also have an obligation to address the actions of their companies. In this sense, we would like to see, I think, greater regulation of human rights due diligence of the companies themselves. And I think we're beginning to see this already. So in the EU, there's recently a regulation where companies will have to do more reporting on their environmental and social impact. And we've also seen a good precedent in the US with the Burma reporting requirements. So companies who are investing in Burma of a certain size, they also need to report on their human rights due diligence and their human rights policies. And so I think there's some good precedents out there, and there's some really concrete steps that we'd like to see states take along those lines.
Thanks, Cynthia. Richard, tell us what more you'd like to see in terms of transparency. What would you like to be able to divulge, and how do we get there?
I think it's the transparency. I think when we think about transparency, we want to think what it's for, and it's essentially for the accountability, so that politicians, do have to be held accountable for the decisions they've made, and that dialogue correctly takes place between citizens who say, well, why did you make 200 requests to Facebook or to Yahoo for data, and the authorities being able to correctly respond to that. It shouldn't just be seen as an end in itself. It's a means to an end, which is a vibrant debate. Just to share a story from when we published our first report, we had one part, the political part of a small government, contact us outraged that we'd said that they had made requests to Facebook. there's no way our government has made any request to Facebook. It's outrageous. And we said, yes, you did. This part of your government made some requests to Facebook. And they went, oh, we'll go off and we'll find out what's going on. And then they came back just a little while later and they said, could you tell us exactly who it was who made the request? Because we're really embarrassed about sending out a mass email saying, the person who made the request to Facebook, please put their hands up. Because it makes it look like we don't know what's going on. And we thought, damn right, you didn't know what was going on. And actually by publishing the transparency report, it created a dialogue within that government. So the different parts of the government spoke to each other about what was happening and perhaps could exercise a degree of control that wasn't happening before. So the reason for doing transparency is exactly to have those kind of dialogues between the different bits of government. And in most governments, there are different camps. Typically, there'll be a sort of very pro-communications, pro-industry camp in a government, and there'll be a pro-security camp in government, and they have to fight it out with each other to get the right balance. And then there's the citizen's interest in this, there's the civil society interests, and we should be stimulating that debate. And the ultimate goal is to get to a point where everybody, or there is a broad consensus, that the level of requesting, whether that's for takedown requests or for data requests, is about right for that country. There is broad public consent for the activity that the government is doing, and that can only happen where all parties know what's happening.
Okay, sorry, man. I'm watching the clock. I'd like to switch topics, actually, to come back to Cynthia's point. Let's talk a little bit about the role of business in the open internet and human rights. So, Bailey, maybe you can, what's your kind of, where are we now? What's your vision? I mean, looking forward again a little bit. What's the role of business in this?
So this is where I think organizations like GNI have a really important role. So first of all, understanding, so when we talk about the role of business or human rights, I think understanding what exactly we're talking about is very useful. And I think that having shared principles, so having the UN guiding principles, having a delineation and saying, well, the company's role, the company has a role to respect. Well, what human rights? When we're talking about the ICT sector, what rights are we talking about? Now, obviously, all of the rights still apply, but there are rights that are much more relevant depending on the nature of your business. So for us, the first was figuring out what are those rights. So when we look at the nature of our particular business, a lot of people, when they talk about companies, they talk about companies as they're a big block. There are all sorts of companies doing all sorts of different things, and certainly for Yahoo, it was figuring out what our human rights impact is. So as a company, figure out, based upon your business operations, where you are, what is your human rights impact? I think doing human rights impact assessments specific to your products, specific to where you are in a geography are critical. I think doing those human rights impact assessment, identifying what your risks, identifying what the company risks are, and creating risk mitigation factors that address those risks. And what do I mean by risk mitigation factors? So where do you store your data? To the extent that you have control over that, are there human rights risks relative to that? How do you handle data access? To the extent that there are issues related to data access, are you looking at those risks, and are you handling those risks appropriately? What are your terms of service? So different companies have different ways of handling jurisdiction. So in our case, we will say that we accede to jurisdiction where if we have a terms of service for requests for content moderation, if your property is offered under a terms of service in that particular jurisdiction, then we would say that particular jurisdiction governs whether or not we would respond to a request. Now, if there's a risk, and so that means, for example, if we have a property, we have a Vietnamese language property, and we did a human rights impact assessment before launching that property, and we decided that this was a huge benefit for human rights because so much conversation was going on in online spaces that wasn't allowed to go on in state-regulated media. So we thought it was a benefit for human rights, but we had very real concerns around storing data in Vietnam. We had very real concerns around terms of service that were Vietnamese language. So those are the types of decisions that you make. And then I come back to multi-stakeholder initiatives, because the fact remains that even that a company has to do human rights impact assessments, you have to mitigate your risk, you have to have senior level support, but you can have all of those things, and this central problem that we're talking about would still exist. So given that, a company has to engage with other stakeholders in policy advocacy, and GNI has been the best platform for that. The other thing that GNI provides is a community of like-minded organizations. It doesn't mean that we always agree. In fact, the fact that we disagree has helped us make decisions. So being able to talk to NGOs, talk through a particular company decision with NGOs, being able to figure out from people on the field, being able to inform our human rights impact assessments from people, from NGOs who are in different parts of the world has been incredibly valuable. Being able to rely upon third-party assessments. So it's not just us as a company saying, look, we do all of this, trust us. It's us also talking to a third-party assessor and having that third-party assessor report back to GNI and say these are the policies and procedures that a company has in place. So I think those are some of the things that a company can and should do. A company can't do this by itself, again, because we are in an ecosystem, and some of the primary levers in this ecosystem are outside of a company's control. I think policy advocacy is incredibly important, but I think everyone should remember that within a well-functioning democracy, companies should not run your democracy. Now, I think recent civil decisions in the United States might put lie to that, but I think in a regularly functioning democracy, it is citizens' obligation and responsibility to be engaged. And there are many young people who use the internet and social media, and they don't think that politics are relevant to them, and they're not engaged in a useful way. And I would hope that with so much of surveillance, et cetera, being in the news, that people would recognize that the laws that legislators are making are relevant to how you interact with the internet, and citizens have an opportunity and obligation to be engaged and involved. And one of the ways we do that as a company is through GNI.
Patrick, but before you answer this, is there a risk of kind of principles exhaustion? I mean, just...
No.
Okay,
no.
and tell us why they're important.
Yes.
I mean, Abele's done a great job telling you, but give us also, you have an example in Georgia, I think, of working with in a multi-stakeholder fashion. Tell us a little bit about that.
Let me start by the first question. So, at the beginning of this session, we asked the revelations of the last year and the debate, what has it led to? I actually think the most important decision was in June 2011, when the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework was set. From that on, all different constituencies, investors, NGOs, business, states, have a framework to relate to. And to implement that framework takes time. That was in 2011, we are now in 2014. We have groups of stakeholders that have come together to implement this UN guiding principles. The Freedom Online Coalition is such a group of stakeholders, which now is to make a statement today, and I think partly based on the UN guiding principles. And for companies, it's the respect. So we were a couple of companies that came together and formed the industry dialogue and see what does respect mean for us? And we published our guiding principles. And the answer to your question, is it just another set of principles? Do they even matter? And I'd say yes, they definitely matter, because it brings momentum within each of these 9 companies, a bottom line within the company to work from and to pursue a point of challenge. So the UN guiding principles, industry dialogue guiding principles, based on that, my company has formed our policy on freedom of expression, and we have moved further to the specifics, which you asked for, Abele, at the beginning here. What does respect mean in actual terms? And for my company, as a first, we have decided to escalate decisions when there are requests for major close down or blocking or something. We escalate those issues from the local ground up to group level. And then, actually, I plotted down some bullets here, which I will read through quickly. What does this point of challenge mean when we have a major request? We ask us, is it submitted through established legal process? Is it submitted to the formal point of contact? Is it in writing? Is it signed? Is the judge identified? Does it clearly identify and specify what the company should do and by when? Does it refer to a specific provision in the law? Is the request consistent through the industry? Does it seem to be overbroad? Is the demand public? Is it possible to ask for a meeting with the authority or the state to clarify? Can we ask for a more narrow scope as to the amount of data, period of time, number of customers, geographical scope, jurisdiction? And most importantly, can we disclose the request or demand? And that's the main challenge. Often we cannot disclose, and that's where we need to move further and find ways to get around that confidentiality. And one area, which is my last point, where we need to work more is that the types of discussions that we have here are most often on a global level or regional level. We need to have these discussions and a way forward also locally. And one example is Georgia. If there's more time, I can tell more about that.
Amy and then Matt, and then we'll go to the audience. And I have a specific request of the audience, so hold your questions and we'll get to you imminently.
Thank you, Matthew. Look, I just wanted to make the point, a lot of the discussion we've had in this space of what can business do to help support a free and open internet has focused, rightly, on business's role as a bit of a watcher of how government is exercising the powers that it has granted itself. And that's very appropriate and it's an important part of it. But I don't think the debate should stop there. In my view, there's more that business can and should do in terms of assessing their own business models of operation against how they impact human rights. And I think it would be a failing of us if we simply focused on those aspects of how business interacts with governments and the government right. And if you come back to issues like the privacy policies of certain internet companies, and yep, Richard, you make the point, well, the privacy policies are there. If you don't like it, don't do business with us. You're absolutely right, that's quite true. But the naivety of many of the users is such that the fact that it's written in a privacy policy somewhere doesn't mean that, therefore it's all legit and we shouldn't worry further. When I look at some of the permissions on commonly downloaded apps that allow the app controllers to get in and access your device's camera and phone and contacts, whether or not you're using the apps are unrelated to the app's purpose. You really have to question the extent to which those are appropriate in a human rights context. If we look at the issue of net neutrality and how business model decisions and profit maximization decisions impact the user experience and the access to content, I think these are all valid questions that business can and should be asking themselves, quite apart from the issue of how they interact with government and are you dealing with requests that come through appropriately. So I think it would be a failing if we looked at the role of business solely through how business should push back and hold to account governments. Absolutely appropriate. But equally, I think there's a very valid question for business to consider every aspect of their own operations and the human rights impacts of those.
Okay, Matt, you have a minute.
Real quick, yeah. I was just going to say, so I've been fairly encouraged with a lot of, especially multinational corporations under the Protect and Respect framework, just with some of the best intentions that they have for, guiding principles for data governance and how they treat that data within, specific jurisdictions. Up until this point, there hasn't been, really great ways under those risk management frameworks for how that data is actually being used per geo and then per region on how that data is actually used and transformed and so forth. And so a lot of the work that we do is as an enforcement mechanism, under that respect framework to ensure that that data governance model, for those best practices consistent with, the human rights, framework that they're trying to enforce is actually, one, enforceable, and then two, they actually understand what's going on per region and per geo under those jurisdictions to make sure that they have a common unified risk management framework, right?
Okay. I'd like to open up to the floor again, but what I'd like you to do, because we've only got a very limited amount of time, we need to think forward. What would we like business to be doing to promoting and protecting human rights? What would you like them to do between now and the next meeting in a year's time? So we're looking for explicit recommendations from you, ideas, thoughts. I mean, we're happy for you to ask questions or whatever you want, but if you can think about that as well, what more would you like to see? That would be very helpful to us, because then we'll have a last round of comments from the panel about what they expect to see from each other in terms of the same. So let me open it. So who has questions or who can make suggestions for business and human rights going forward? Come on, there's got to be somebody out there who... I will, but is there somebody who hasn't spoken yet who would like to go first? Yes, yes.
Thanks. Joy Liddycote from APC, and welcome to Amy Adams. fellow New Zealander. I think one thing that would be really great is to pick up this suggestion that there should be national conversations. And I think this would be an excellent practical follow-up activity, particularly for the Freedom Online Coalition members, but also other governments and stakeholders who are here, to take these conversations back into national contexts, either into their respective internet governance processes or other public policy dialogue that are internet related. And then report back about those at the next Freedom Online Coalition meeting in Mongolia next year, about what were some of the ways in which those conversations were picked up. Thanks.
Thank you. Who else? All right, in the front.
Thank you. Rena Safaralieva, Transparency International, Azerbaijan. International business working in countries like Azerbaijan, they tried to include into their corporate social responsibility programs politically non-sensitive issues like support to education, arts and culture. So what we would like the international business do in our part of the world is to put support to the human rights issues into their corporate social responsibility programs. And I would like to use this opportunity, and I hope that the international business working in my part of the world will hear this message. Thank you.
Thank you. In the front here.
Thank you. Eline Vronsky from the Danish Institute for Human Rights. I think what we would like to see business do is assess the impact they have on human rights, the overall business, but also their daily decisions. For example, when you close down a page, not only look at whether this is respecting Facebook's policy, but whether this is negative or positive towards human rights in general, and inform the people whose rights might be impacted, because I agree that many times the customer or the human rights defender behind, they don't know where their data is being used, so that is an important point. So reporting back, not only in general, but also specifically to the persons that might be affected by your decisions would be something interesting.
Gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Mike Rispoli from Privacy International. So I have two requests, one for business and one for government. I think that what we would like to see from industry is a larger push, I think, for legislative proposals that are introduced for surveillance reform. Industry has many more resources than civil society, and so I think if industry took a leading role for the inside track to maybe get some of these reforms passed through government, that would be incredibly helpful. So just not rhetoric being made from the top from CEOs about how reform is needed, but actual the grunt work that is needed to pass law. And then for government, especially since you are from New Zealand, one of the Five Eyes states, we would like to see more transparency around how information is shared amongst the Five Eye countries as well, because at the moment there's very little out there, and so we are not sure how our privacy rights are being infringed upon once one government collects information on us and then it is shared amongst others as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Patrick, I think you want to come back.
Yes, in response to that, resources is one thing, and one can argue who has the most resources. Leverage is another thing, and if we can work together, NGOs, business, and governments, and discuss reform of surveillance legislation, and that's exactly what is happening in Georgia, where both the company which I'm representing and NGOs, in that case Transparency International and Young Lawyers Association, and politicians within government discuss reform. And that's when there is leverage, when there is joint discussion and joint dialogue to move forward. And just another remark, and that is that we heard this morning at the first session that freedom must apply and be defended offline as well as online. And I think actually it was not a misstatement. It should be offline as well as online. For our users in many parts of the world, they still don't use data. They use traditional telecoms, SMS and voice. And from the user point of view, a closure of the SMS network is as much an infringement of their freedom of expression as the closure of the internet or parts of the internet. So when we talk about freedom online, let's not forget, offline, and in pushing respect and protect of freedom of expression.
Okay, Richard, I know you want to go, but I'm hoping the audience will give us an extra 5 minutes. I know that lunch is next, I believe. So, but I would like to take a couple more questions and then give each of the panelists. Do you want to pass?
No, get the questions.
All right. So, who else would like to? I know there was a question in the back. And anyone else? Now's the time. Yeah.
I'm going to take another stab at hygiene because I don't think I was understood earlier. I know all of you companies, and in fact Facebook quite well, Yahoo as well, have excellent security programs for yourselves and your users. I'm asking that you and governments and the advocacy groups here lend your voices to telling the public the things that they can do and insisting that enterprise observe basic cyber hygiene. Dentists have told us if we brush our teeth and floss and visit a dentist twice a year, we reduce tooth decay. We know what the equivalent measures are for enterprises in cybersecurity, knowing what's on their networks, trusted software, limiting administrative permissions, having real-time systems that detect and mitigate, that keep us safe against the majority of known attacks. So I would ask this group in each of your incarnations to lend your voices to the hygiene message.
Thank you. Gentleman here in the middle. Anyone else? Just raise your hand.
Yes, you wanted some recommendations.
Yes, please.
David P. Syme, International Insurance Society Ambassador. We're spending a lot of time now putting 3 billion people from poverty into middle class, so that's the attempt. So we're using the cloud and mobile phones to do that. So I think as we're using this technology and we move 3 billion, we won't want to see security problems and bubbles in this new society. So I think the microfinance and microinsurance should be registered as a recommendation.
Okay. Anyone else before we go to the panelists? All right. Amy, a minute or two, wrapping up, recommendations.
Okay, well look, I mean, we've covered some really interesting ground today, and I guess I would come back to where I started, which is that part of the work that we all have to do to enhance the freedom and security of the internet has to start with having quite a detailed, and it will be a difficult conversation about what the intersection and definitions of these freedoms are. And it's very easy to talk in sort of generic, high-level statements around freedom of expression and the like, which we all buy into, we all support. But at the same time, there will always be those intersections at the time at which one person's rights impact someone else's. So when you're talking about online harassment, whether you're talking about presumption of innocence, when you're talking about rule of law, whether you're talking about the application of news media principles and how that applies in the internet world with bloggers and the like, and we have a case at the moment in New Zealand around whether a blogger is subject to the same sort of protections of traditional news media sources. So I think in some ways, before we can really embed some of these principles of freedom online, we have to challenge ourselves to have some of those really difficult questions about exactly where the intersections of some of these rights and responsibilities, both at an individual, at a company level, at a state level, at community levels, sit. Because I think a lot of the challenges and the difficulties we have had is that we haven't really sometimes had those discussions in a very confrontational, head-on way. Exactly what does it mean in this situation where my right to express myself impinges on your right to be safe online or to not be harassed? Where does my right to access content impact on your right as a content owner and content producer to decide the way you want your content to be available? And until we really work through some of those intersectional issues, I think it's going to continue to be very difficult. Just coming back to the sort of the topic of the panel discussion specifically, I guess, just want to re-emphasise that point I made, that I see businesses having a critical role in this space, not only in terms of their interaction with and safeguarder of how governments operate, but I think they do need to think quite a lot more critically about how their operations impact on the user experience and the user ability to have a free and open internet. And can I just comment on the digital hygiene point, because it's one of my particular bugbears as well. I think we all have a role in a wider discussion and an educational role with our young people, particularly about what it means to be digital citizens. And I think we're probably in that transitional generation where we've grown up without that being absolutely part of who we are. But I know with my children, it's so intuitive that the smart device is an extension of their arm. We really do have to think about how, as parents, as educators, as society, raise and instruct our young people to be digital citizens and to think about some of those hygiene messages in the same way we, as you say, think about brushing our teeth and putting on our seatbelts, that they become absolutely instinctive.
Thank you. Richard.
So, the reference to digital hygiene in the context of a dental analogy reminded me of the best piece of security advice I ever heard, which was, your password is like a toothbrush. You shouldn't share it with anyone else. And if anyone else has used it, you should throw it away and get a new one, which, yeah. And I agree on the point. I think we all do have that responsibility. And actually, the point I want to make is I think we're all on a journey together. I actually think there's a really important moment in the journey where we should be looking at legislative models. I think those are actually a top priority, and what do good legislative models look like? And to arrive at that, actually learning, the experience you gave, Amy, of New Zealand producing a very transparent setup for its surveillance activities or its data requesting activities, within frameworks like this coalition, being able to share that, being able to say, hey, we did this, we published this data and the world didn't end. So maybe it's okay for other countries to do the same thing, and to learn for those countries who are in the Freedom Online Coalition, who are by definition self-selecting progressive countries on this agenda, to be able to share information and to arrive at good legislative models and then encourage other countries to adopt them would be superb. And I think in all of our interests. I mean, we as companies absolutely have an interest in good legislative models being out there because we're subject to them on a regular basis. Then the second part of the journey is when you're on a platform like this and you're subject to criticism, the tendency is to become defensive because that's why your company employs you. But the reality is that we are all learning together. And I think everybody in this room is on a common mission. All of us, and everybody who works in my company, I fundamentally believe this, believes that they are producing a service, which is a commercial service, of course it is, but it's a service which fundamentally advances human rights. It is there to help people deliver on their economic, social, cultural, political, and civic rights. That's why we get up in the morning and build the service that we do, because we think it helps people. And so, as part of that mission, I accept we're not there yet. We need to be self-critical. We need criticism from other people. That's actually extremely helpful. So people will criticize you, you'll defend it, and then you'll go back to your colleagues and go, damn, but I think we haven't got this right, we've got to try and fix it. That, again, is part of the process. I would love us to get to the point where we can be as trusting with each other, to come back to your word of trust, as we should be to fix some of these things, because the answer is between all of us. The answer to fixing an issue with bad behavior online in New Zealand is for service providers, civic society, and the government in New Zealand to sit down together. Frankly, that's going to produce the best outcome. But that has to happen in a trusted space. So my two pleas are really good legislative models, and that we can create trusted spaces where we can accept that we're all on the same side, even though we sometimes combat each other in public, but we're essentially on the same side, and actually focus on finding the solutions that are in the interests of the people who use the services that we provide.
Thank you. Patrick.
Yes, 3 short forward-looking notes. One is that the Industry Dialogue 9 telcos have decided to start a depository of regulatory frameworks, responding to the point that you said earlier, Ebele, that there needs to be better understanding what is the legal frameworks locally around there. My second note is that initiatives such as the Global Network Initiative and the Industry Dialogue build leverage, and any company that is interested to know what we're doing is welcome to talk to me and maybe participate in a call or two to learn more what we do. And my third is the one I elaborated on earlier. We should aim together to protect freedom of expression and privacy, disregarding what type of ICT service that is at risk.
Thank you. Matt.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So my background is as a solution architect and a reverse engineer. So I look at any problem in the reverse, right? And so if you make the assumption that we're making headway in preservation of human rights across, the internet and so forth, regardless of what the policy impacts are, fundamentally the way in which the internet is designed and the complexity that exists today, there are very few technologies that can actually enable you to do any of this that we're talking about, right? There's a lack of portability of evidence, the inability to transparently and independently authenticate, how data is being transformed across all these different infrastructures. And so, from my perspective, what I'm encouraged, and I do believe that we're a solution to this problem, is that, the ability to actually tackle these issues at scale across all these different disparate, geographic, regions under all these different governance models, fundamentally has to be addressed from a technological perspective. And without those underpinnings, the rest of this is just talk. And that's just my perspective. So.
Thanks.
So I actually echo Richard's point about policy, about sort of policy best practice and legislative frameworks, and be able to share that. I think there are the countries we always talk about, but I think there are many, many, many other countries. There's a comment about emerging markets. I think across the continent, there are opportunities to really shape policy that can support a better and freer internet. So I think policy guidelines on legislation that creates an open, freer network, and that also takes into consideration issues of access. I think that would be critical. I think the corollary to that are company practices. And I think GNI is a space where that can start to happen, but really thinking specifically about what are best practices when it comes to companies. And I think to the point about having an open space, I would also encourage NGOs to see themselves as people who can come to the table with solutions. So there is definitely a role for challenging, but I think coming and saying, this is something that we've observed, and this is something we would recommend, I think is huge. And I think those are the types of conversations that go on within GNI and that have been implemented at our company. So to the extent that we can create a space where we can have a dialogue around specific solutions, and that this space can actually start, in conjunction with organizations like GNI, can create best or company practices that address real issues, so not in the abstract, but real issues, I think that would be a huge step forward.
Wonderful. Cynthia.
So I hate to be the person standing between everyone and lunch, just a couple of quick things. To go back to your question about principles, I think principles are really important because they provide guidance, but they're not enough. And I think I just want to underscore that the kind of trust us, we're managing our human rights risk approach is not going to satisfy, I think, either users or investors or human rights groups. And that's why I think mechanisms like the GNI, which does provide a credible way for companies to demonstrate that they are managing human rights risks, is so important. And I think I would be remiss in my role if I didn't mention that I think we would love to see some telcos join GNI's ranks in the near future, in the next year. Second, to raise a point that was raised earlier, if the real problem here sometimes is the law itself and what the government is doing with the law, then we would really like to see companies throw their full weight behind trying to change that law. And I think that is an area that's ripe for collaboration with civil society as well. And I think that's particularly true in countries where open policy debates are possible because you can actually make some leeway there. And I think home governments also have a role to play in raising diplomatically or through trade channels problematic surveillance laws, illegal practices, and unjustified surveillance as well, on behalf of their companies and on behalf of their commitment to freedom online. And then finally, just one last thing, I think venues like this are really important, but I really would like to see governments start to bring their law enforcement and security agency officials here as well, because I really think it's important for a full, robust debate for those agencies and those ministries to really hear what the concerns are and to put a face to the activists and the journalists and the human rights defenders that are directly...
Tempted to say they're here, they just haven't identified themselves.
Yeah, maybe you're here. If you are, please come up and talk to me afterwards. But yes, I think we really need more of that cross-department, cross-ministry dialogue to really get to the crux of the problem.
And to add to that, it's not just them listening, I also think it's us listening as well. Because I think we speak within a particular vacuum, and I think understanding from them what their concerns are, I think it's something that would be very helpful.
Agree?
Okay. A couple of things that resonate for myself and CDT. Greater transparency, absolute must. Trusted spaces, love that. Multi-stakeholder trusted spaces, that's definitely what we should be looking for and what we should be aiming for, and I'd like to see real progress on that before next year. Greater engagement in GNI, in the telecom industry dialogue, in other forums such as that, incredibly important. I think that's something we should all aspire to and encourage others to join. And then we touched upon, but very briefly, national level discussions. And I think that's another very important thing for us to suggest, recommend as we go forward. So, on that note, round of applause for the panel, please. Thank you very much for your participation. And hopefully some of this discussion will have been or may be reflected in the recommendations that are going to be announced at 2:30. Who knows, we'll keep our fingers crossed. But thanks very much.